It's questions the human mind cannot answer. Out of reach, past all we can see, hear, and touch, beyond all we understand, lies the extraordinary.
Emergency, emergency.
The extraordinary is living a real-life nightmare. Two passengers on a light plane. The pilot collapsed at the controls. Those on board don't know how to fly. There is only one chance of survival. 1 in a million.
Emergency, emergency. The pilot has collapsed. Nobody can fly the plane. Emergency.
It is the eerie moment of death faced by migrant farm worker Maria. A near-death experience and the simple, mundane vision that changed 2 lives forever.
It was like a miracle had happened, and I had the privilege of being a part of this.
It is the supernatural talent of this autistic boy who somehow reproduced from memory the most intricate detail of world architecture, and the unexplained brilliance of this Adelaide boy who plays complex operas and symphonies after hearing them just once.
They said to me that he was retarded, and that if I wasn't happy with that, forget him and have another baby.
The extraordinary is the night Don Lane saw a ghost, that of his dead grandmother.
She was standing there at the top of the stairs. She had this light around her, and she was smiling at us.
And how she reappeared to him a second time, years later.
I didn't disbelieve that Don thought he saw his grandmother, but I just thought it was a story that maybe over the years Don had wittingly or unwittingly embellished.
Just some of the stories that lie beyond our normal understanding. Tonight on The Extraordinary.
You'll be surprised how Don's ghost came to haunt Bert Newton. More on that soon. Good evening. I'm Warwick Moss. One of the things about life that will never change is its glorious uncertainty. One moment everything seems ordered and in place. The next moment, nothing makes sense. Our whole lives turned upside down by the unexplained or the unexpected. Imagine you're in a plane headed for home when the pilot, the only pilot, slumps forward on the controls, unconscious. Neither you or the only other passenger have any idea how to fly. Your only hope, the radio.
Emergency, emergency. This is Alpha Alpha Zulu. Emergency, emergency.
Alpha Alpha Zulu, this is Qantas Flight 22. Go ahead, please.
It was the Sunday before Christmas 1980. The Beechcraft Super King Air was cruising at a speed of 260 knots, 8,000 metres above the ocean, 650 kilometres northeast of Sydney. There was no sign of land, and no pilot at the controls.
Emergency, emergency. The pilot has collapsed and nobody can fly the plane. Emergency.
It should have been a routine flight from Lord Howe Island to the mainland. The takeoff at 6:15 a.m. was uneventful, so the skipper, Peter Bell, set his course for Sydney and switched over to automatic pilot.
Lord Howe, this is Alpha Alpha Zulu. We're heading southwest on track towards Sydney. 70 miles out of Lord Howe, I gave the usual position report and proceeded to fill in the flight plan.
That flight plan was for Advance Airlines Beechcraft Super King Air, Alpha Alpha Zulu. We chartered a similar kind of aircraft from Oxley Airlines to help us reconstruct that fateful flight back in 1918. The Advance Airlines flight was basically a cargo run, but by chance, there were 2 passengers on board. It was a chance that was to prove very lucky indeed. One of the passengers was the pilot's cousin, Ron Squires. The other was Detective Lance Sturton, who was originally booked on a later flight, but changed his plans at the last minute.
The flight was uneventful for some time, and I believe we were up about 27,000 feet proceeding towards Sydney in very good clear weather. And I was reading a book and suddenly looked up towards the front of the aircraft and saw what I believed to be the pilot's arms waving about.
That wave, in fact, was a warning that things on board the King Air were about to go haywire.
The last thing I remember doing was actually twisting around and yelling at him to get his attention, to ask him if he was warm enough. Apparently my message to Sturton got somewhat garbled because at that point I was totally out of it.
Lance Sturton rushed up to the cockpit, where he discovered just how grave the situation was.
Pilot, can you fly the plane? No.
You've on the radio, I'll try and fix him.
Right.
After I'd realised that this was for real, that there was something wrong in the plane, I looked around the dashboard at the instruments and tried to think, what do I do next? And I saw a microphone.
Emergency, emergency. This is Alpha Alpha Zulu, emergency.
Then came the second lucky chance. The radio, which could be heard by everyone on board, had been preset to an international and not a domestic frequency.
Emergency, emergency. Alpha Alpha Zulu, do you read me?
Eventually, the radio came to life and I heard a Qantas jumbo jet.
Alpha Alpha Zulu, this is Qantas Flight 22. Go ahead, please.
Our pilot has collapsed. Nobody can fly the plane.
Stand by, Alpha Alpha Zulu.
The Qantas pilot went into emergency mode, firstly contacting the control tower at Sydney Airport. But he wasn't the only one who heard the distress call from Alpha Alpha Zulu. Another coincidence, and perhaps the most amazing of all. That second aircraft was another Advance Airlines flight on the Lord Howe Sydney route. The very one Lance Sturton should have been on.
Alpha Alpha Zulu, this is Kilo Zulu Lima. My name is Terry Abbott. I'm about 15 minutes behind you. Just remain calm.
By now, Terry Abbott on board Kilo Zulu Lima was catching on fast. Not only was the troubled aircraft from his company, the unconscious pilot was his mate Peter Bell. And, by chance, yet again, Bell's plane was identical to his.
The instrument panels are the same instruments are in the same place, the same readouts, what you see. So it was fairly easy for me to get them to set up a certain circumstance in the aeroplane, and I knew then what they'd be doing. I knew what speed they'd be doing, what altitude they'd be at.
If the plane's in automatic pilot, don't touch anything.
If they'd gone off autopilot, I doubt that they would have been able to control the aeroplane.
On board Alpha Alpha Zulu, Detective Sturton was trying desperately to revive the pilot, and Ron Squires was taking instructions from Terry Abbott. As the minutes ticked by, it became clearer Squires could have to save the day, even though he'd never flown a plane before.
The first priority, of course, for the following pilot was to get me to slow down so he could try and catch up, because visual contact was very important.
Okay, what do I do?
So this was the moment of truth to me. It's the first time I'd touched a plane, and I slowly moved the needles and I watched the two appropriate gauges.
Bit by bit, Terry Abbott was closing the gap between his aircraft and Alpha Alpha Zulu so he could make visual contact. Then, as they approached Sydney, he began coaching Ron Squires on how to begin a gradual descent. Alpha Alpha Zulu was now just 185 kilometres from the airport. The most difficult and dangerous task lay ahead. Someone had to land the plane. Despite the remarkable achievements so far, it would take a miracle to get the plane back on the ground.
Where am I?
And it looked as though that miracle was about to happen. Alpha Alpha Zulu's pilot, Peter Bell, regained consciousness. But the drama wasn't over.
I'm okay. I'm okay. You're incoherent.
When they first said that he was coming round, that he was starting to wake up, I told them not to let him touch anything, because if he'd suddenly woken up and thought everything was okay and put his hands up, he could disconnect the autopilot and pass out again.
I'm okay.
But Bell seemed fine, and Alpha Alpha Zulu was on track, headed for Sydney Airport.
I looked out the right window into the rear and I could actually see Terry's aeroplane coming up. At that point I took control of the aeroplane, disconnected the autopilot, peeled up and went around and behind Terry and came up alongside him.
While his mate was unconscious, Terry Abbott had been in constant contact with the Sydney Tower. They knew what was happening and were ready for any emergency.
Terry came up on the company frequency at that stage and explained to me that everything had been arranged with the tower at Sydney. There was no need for me to talk to anybody. They just gave me a red carpet approach straight in.
Peter Bell and Alpha Alpha Zulu really were incredibly lucky. Firstly, he could have been up there, unconscious and alone, with no one to help. Remember, by rights, Lance Sturton shouldn't have even been on the flight. Then there was the radio frequency, preset so that the Mayday calls could be heard by the Qantas flight. QF-22 had monitored the whole affair and been able to pass on vital medical advice from a doctor on board. There was the coincidence that Alpha Alpha Zulu and Kilo Zulu Lima were identical. And finally, there was Bell's amazing recovery at the crucial moment. Chance after chance after chance, which combined to help avert a disaster.
Alpha Alpha Zulu, this is Sydney Tower, runway 25, clear for landing.
Sydney Tower, this is Alpha Alpha Zulu, and we're coming in.
And as we came in, I was ready for one heck of a bump. And all along the runway, of course, all you see are emergency vehicles and flashing lights. You know, real celebrity welcome, who needs it? But would you believe it's the best landing I've ever known Peter to do?
The plane touched down on runway 25 at 8:18 a.m. on Sunday the 21st of December 1980. Alpha Alpha Zulu was only 3 minutes behind schedule. There's a common theme that seems to run through the stories told by people who confront the moment of death and then come back. They talk of a floating, out-of-body experience, of a brilliant white glow, of a strange peace of mind that envelops them in their final moment. But in the case of a migrant farm worker named Maria, something ridiculously mundane happened. She saw something, and the simple thing she saw changed a young medical professional's life forever.
First, it is a story of a shoe. An ordinary shoe in an extraordinary circumstance. It was a tennis shoe, the canvas type, well worn with laces that came all the way up to the top. It was dark blue but faded, and it was heavily scuffed along its side in the area of the little toe. One of its laces draped over the side and ran under its heel. The shoe was in no way exceptional, except in its location. It sat there precariously, high above ground, on a ledge on the 3rd story of Harborview Hospital in the city of Seattle, in the state of Washington. And its existence changed the life of this woman. She is the second part of the story. Her name is Kimberly Clark Sharp. She's an eminent medical professional in the United States. She's a mother with a master's degree in medical social work and is a faculty member at the University of Washington, an associate professor lecturing second-year medical students about issues of death and dying. The incident that links Kimberly Clark Sharp to the old shoe happened 17 years ago. It set her on a life course that went against everything she had been raised to believe.
I was not brought up to believe something like this. This wasn't, the closest I got to anything like this was maybe as a child hearing fairy tales. In fact, my parents to this day think that I'm committing career suicide to even be in this, except that my career has flourished. So.
On the other hand, there are those in medical circles who regard Kim Sharp as one of the world's most astute authorities on near-death experiences. Aside from her traditional medical career, she is head of the Northwest chapter of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Since the day she first saw the worn tennis shoe, she has recounted and recorded the near-death experiences of hundreds of patients who have gone beyond the brink of life and returned to tell incredible stories. But to this day, she remains most deeply affected by the story of a woman who had double cardiac arrest and returned to life in the intensive care ward of Harborview Hospital. The woman was a migrant worker named Maria. It was April 1976.
She had come to the big city for the first time, to the city of Seattle, had a massive heart attack.
As doctors fought to save Maria, her heart stopped for several minutes. It was a near miracle in itself that the doctors brought her back.
What she told me was that when she calmed down, was that during her resuscitation, she had found herself at the ceiling level, and she pointed to the corner of the ceiling, where she could look down and observe her own resuscitation.
And then she told Kim Sharp the story of the old shoe.
She felt like she was about 3 stories above the ground. And she is looking at a tennis shoe that's sitting on a ledge. She said the tennis shoe was dark blue, very worn, that there was a scruff placed by the little toe, and that she saw the lace going under the heel. And the reason she was agitated, the reason that she wanted to see somebody, is because she wanted someone to get the shoe.
There was no shoe on the ledge outside of Maria's window, but Kim Sharp was curious enough to look further.
So I start going from room to room to room, looking down on the ledges, so that I can go back to Maria and tell her that I have really done a thorough search.
But on the opposite side of the hospital, on a different floor altogether, Kim Sharp saw something.
I walked into one room, and this is such a vivid memory for me, because I remember the window. I remember walking to the window getting closer to me. The view was to the west. I had looked in many windows by this point and not seen anything. I looked down, and to my shock, my utter shock, there was a tennis shoe. It was dark blue. It was beat up. Now, from my perspective, looking down, I couldn't see the little toe area. The little toe area was on the outside of the building, not towards the building at all. I could see the tip of the lace coming out from under the heel. I had to presume that someplace on the outside of the shoe there was a continuum. There was a lace that indeed went under the shoe in order for me to see what was coming out. I could not believe my eyes. I opened the window and reached down and plucked out the shoe.
Maria's description of the shoe had been accurate to the last intricate detail, all the way down to the scuffed area of the left toe. There were no other buildings on that side of the hospital. Such details on the outer rim of the shoe could not be seen from anywhere on the ground or from anywhere inside the hospital.
I took the shoe. I went back to Maria, but I put it behind my back And then I brought the shoe around and showed her. And we both began to cry and hug, and it was a very emotional moment. It was like a miracle had happened, and I had had the privilege of being a part of this.
The night Don Lane saw a ghost, and how, years later, the same ghost paid a visit to his friend, Bert Newton.
All of a sudden, for no God-given reason, my chair collapsed.
I just pointed my finger at him and I said, I told you someday she was going to get you, and she got you.
Also, the unexplained talents of two autistic savants, young men once thought retarded, but now regarded in the genius class. One from London.
This drawing's very fabulous, look gorgeous.
It certainly does look gorgeous, Stephen, you can say that again.
The other in Adelaide.
I would put a symphony, Beethoven symphony, Brahms symphony, and I would take excerpts from the symphony, chords and other structures, put them on the night tape. Next morning you'd get up, usually next morning, and go to the piano and he played those same chords on the piano.
Things that happen in our youth are often forgotten, left behind in a haze of happenings that merge into one. But for young Morton Isaacson, or Don Lane, as he's now known, an experience of youth will never be forgotten. You see, Don saw a ghost in his hometown in New York, and years later, that ghost may have paid a visit to Don's friend, Bert Newton, in Melbourne.
Oh, wow! Miss, you missed me!
The story begins one night around half a century ago at the Isaacson house in the Queens district of New York. Morton Isaacson is 7 years old, and he and his cousin Arthur are home alone. It's not long after young Morton's much-loved grandma Fleming passed away, and all the adults are out at a wake for the old lady.
Now, I was really sort of close with my grandmother. I can't remember a lot of things about her, but the images I do have of her are very lasting ones, you know, what she was like, you know, how she liked being with me, things like that. You know.
An old two-story house, empty except for the two boys. Nothing untoward, nothing to be afraid of, until Morton gets up to go to the bathroom.
And I stepped outside into the darkened hallway. And there, at the top of the stairs, was my grandmother, standing there, smiling at me. When I first saw it, I got taken back. And I thought, oh dear, you know, and then I looked at it again, and she was smiling. And I felt a bit calmer, but I was still extremely frightened, as you can imagine a 7-year-old boy would be. And I ran back into the room. And my cousin said to me, what's the matter with you? And I said, well, you know, my grandmother is outside. And he said, oh, she can't be outside. He said, she's dead.
He knows it wasn't a dream, and eventually he convinces Arthur to go and see for himself.
So we both stepped outside the door, and she was still there. She was standing there at the top of the stairs. She had this light around her, and she was smiling at us. And we were both transfixed, I suppose, for what seemed like an eternity, but I imagine it would have only been about 10 seconds. And then we did something that looked like something on one of those old 40s black and white comedy movies where we both sort of went, hoo-rah, and ran back into the room and underneath the covers. And, you know, we sort of got under the covers and stayed under there.
Stayed there, in fact, until much later, when Mr. and Mrs. Isaacson came home.
To this day, I can see my mother and father standing in that doorway. I can see the image of the two of them there. And I said, Grandma was here. And my mother looked at my father, you know, and he looked at her, and she sort of smiled for a minute. She said, what do you mean? And I said, she was here. My cousin said, yeah, she was here. She was standing at the top of the stairs, and we both saw her.
Well, from that scary night in New York, let's flash forward to the late 1970s. And Melbourne's Radio 3UZ where Don Lane has a show with his old sparring partner, Bert Newton.
Bert used to send me up blind about my grandmother, Mrs. Fleming. And because we had Kevin Arnett in those days who dealt in all these things and all of that, Bert would always be into his thing where he'd go, woo, you know, do all of that business. And he used to send me up about that. And there's a very funny tag to that, which I think he should tell you about.
I didn't disbelieve that Don thought he saw his grandmother, but I just thought it was a story that maybe over the years Don had wittingly or unwittingly embellished to a point where he really believed that she was up there cooking something for him at the top of the stairs. And I used to have a lot of fun with this, both on television and radio.
And I always used to say to him, she's going to get you. I said, I've had a lot of people tell me that there's this spirit that hangs around, and I really think that it's my grandmother that's around me all the time, looking after me, you see. I said, but someday she's going to get you.
Welcome back. It's time to go gardening now. And wait.
Years later, there's still one of those radio shows that niggles Bert Newton. As usual, it was outrageous and irreverent. But maybe there was one Grandma Fleming gag too many.
He gave me a lead-in that was just too good to ignore. So I made this flippant reply, including the name of Mrs. Fleming and doing the woo and all that sort of stuff. In this radio studio at 3Z, all of a sudden, for no God-given reason, my chair collapsed. And it was a strong, sturdy, radio-type chair that aren't supposed to collapse.
I don't know whether it was coincidence or whatever it was, but the wheels went out from underneath this chair. He flipped up in he flipped up in the air and fell backwards on the floor, and he rolled over on the back, and Peter Berner's laughing, and I'm laughing. I mean, people who are listening to radio would have thought, these guys are nuts, they're doing sight gags on radio, you know? And anyway, he was sitting down on the floor, and we were really laughing about it, and I just pointed my finger at him, and I said, I told you someday she was going to get you, and she got you.
And at this very moment, I thought, you know, he's having a breakdown of some kind, too much television, and the attention has gotten too much for him, and suddenly realised that he honestly believed that Mrs. Fleming had caused this to happen.
And up and cue.
Back then, it was all a bit of a hoot. But 15 years later, Bert now wonders about that day. Was it a mishap? Or, just possibly, the sequel to a 7-year-old's vision all those years earlier?
If Mrs. Fleming is where I believe she is, and if she understands that I'm a good Catholic boy, I don't think she'd want me to come to any harm. Just a gentle reminder not to be too, as Don would say, too smart-ass.
The human mind is said to be one of the greatest untapped resources in the world. Science tells us we only ever use a tiny fraction of its potential. But occasionally, we are given a momentary glimpse of its limitless power. On opposite sides of the world tonight, 2 young men sit at whom we can only marvel. Alison Holloway, with the first of 2 remarkable stories.
This is probably the most photographed view of London. Every tourist surely has this shot in the family album. But one remarkable young man doesn't need a camera to record the picture. His eyes take in every detail. His slender hand places those images on paper. What he really sees when he draws, no one knows. Stephen Wiltshire is autistic, trapped in an emotionless maze which he can't leave and no one can penetrate. But from this inner world flows a remarkable talent. His genius is in his visual memory of architecture, striking accounts that have a whimsical nature. Is there a city that you've liked the most?
I like New York the most.
He can look at a building, look at a landscape, anatomize it, and then translate that to paper. Can I explain that actual process? No, I can't. It would be like having to explain what is the nature of genius. And I'm afraid there isn't an explanation.
Margaret Hewson is Stephen's guiding hand through the minefield of publishing. Floating Cities is his third book, evidence indeed of his talent, which first showed itself over a decade ago when Stephen was 8.
Stephen, you started drawing at a very young age. Did you realise then you had an enormous talent?
Yes, enormous talent is do memory drawings, imaginary drawings of cityscapes, streets, houses, buildings, blocks of flats, and aerial views.
What I've seen now is equally bewildering and truly quite astonishing, because they have become increasingly sophisticated. He's far more confident, he's far more assured in his line, and then there has been a very exciting new development, which is a colour explosion. Autistic artistic savants don't normally use colour, so we weren't really expecting this.
But there have been instances when the capacity of savants to use their gifts has simply stopped, as mysteriously as it appeared.
If these children were going to lose their talent, they would lose it at puberty, which is archetypal, if you like. Stephen was different and continues to be different and continues to develop. So there's absolutely no reason to, for anyone to feel at the moment that his talent will disappear or that the development will cease.
And now a fourth book is in production. The subject, America. What else?
And you want to go back?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to live there.
But Stephen's greatest work so far isn't a Manhattan skyline, but a view of London's embankment. It took him 4.5 hours to complete.
Because this drawing's very fabulous, look gorgeous.
It certainly does look gorgeous, Stephen. You can say that again. Modest as well, why not?
While Stephen Wiltshire continues to amaze in Britain, there's a young boy in Adelaide who may be his musical equal. More on that in a minute. Patrick Farley looks a typical kid. Red hair, freckles, at times a cheeky grin. But Patrick's not a typical kid. He was born autistic. At one stage, his mother was advised to put him in a home and forget him. But it seems the key to Patrick Farley's whole being has been found. Music. Sweet, sweet music. The music, appropriately, is Haydn's Surprise Symphony. The pianist is 11-year-old Patrick Farley. And the real surprise is that the magic of music helped free this boy, who was trapped in the lonely, silent world of autism. Incredibly, just a few years ago, doctors wrote him off as a lost cause.
They said to me that he was retarded, and that if I wasn't happy with that, forget him and have another baby.
Now, that lost boy is being hailed as a genius, thanks to a mother who never lost faith.
I wasn't prepared to just forget him. He was my son, my only son.
Barbara Farley is a fighter who fought for her son despite all his disabilities. At the age of 7, Patrick was totally helpless. He couldn't talk. He couldn't even feed himself.
Right from day one, I never accepted that Patrick was a total vegetable. I always maintained that if you treat a retarded child as a retarded child, you will inevitably end up with a retarded adult.
And young Patrick battled too. He had 15 operations in his first 2 years. Then when he was 7, there were the psychological tests, which reached that damning conclusion: retarded. But Barbara Farley was convinced there was something very special about her little boy.
As a small baby, he used to lie across my feet when I was playing piano, and I thought he could possibly be deaf and just feeling the vibrations. I had no idea of the enormity of the talent of Patrick at that stage. And I, as I said, used to sit him on my knee, and then found that he wanted to play the piano with one finger on each hand. And he would play tunes, and I thought, oh, yeah, I'm imagining it, you know. And then other people, friends, would come round, and they would hear him. So I knew I wasn't imagining it.
That tiny clue was the key which would eventually unlock Patrick's cell of silence and prove the doctors wrong. Far from being deaf, Patrick, in fact, had super-sensitive hearing. You see, long after the sound of the notes had faded away, he was still able to pick up lingering vibrations, assess them, and store them away in his brain.
I just felt as if I was constantly banging my head against the brick wall. Doctors told me he was retarded and I should put him away. And yet I knew he had this talent. I knew he had this ability. Nobody would listen to me until finally comes Lyndall, and she was his guardian angel, his mentor, still is.
He had no ability to perceive what was going on in the normal environment. So I had to assess his mental abilities, and I'd been told that the psychological report showed that he had the equivalent mental ability of a child of 15 months.
When he was 9 years old, Patrick was taken under Lyndall Hendrickson's wing. She's the supervisor at Adelaide University's School of Music and is well known for her work with child prodigies. But Patrick Farley, who'd never had a music lesson in his life, presented a unique problem.
How can you communicate with a child who can't understand what you're talking about? So I was left to my devices to somehow work through music, as it was thought, to teach him to speak.
Blue one.
Hello, Patrick.
Those devices included recorded tapes combining music and speech, which were played to Patrick every night before he went to bed.
For instance, I would put a symphony, Beethoven symphony, Brahms symphony, and I would take excerpts from the symphony, chords and other structures, put them on the night tape. Next morning he would get up, usually next morning, and go to the piano, and he played those same chords on the piano. So he had retained the memory of them overnight.
Hundreds of hours later, not only was Patrick pounding out the classics, he was beginning to recognise and utter the odd word or two.
Milk. Yes, wonderful milk.
It's not unusual for autistic children to repeat words, almost parrot fashion. But again, Patrick was different, as we saw and heard for ourselves.
I love you, Lord.
I love you too.
For the first time, unprompted, he spoke those words. The words his mother has longed to hear for the last 11 years.
And yesterday, of course, when he came up to me spontaneously and said, I love you, Mum, words can't explain how I felt.
Now, Patrick can communicate, and those who care can understand.
I really like you.
His progress has astounded and excited the experts, including Verity Botroff, a lecturer in special education at Flinders University.
What I'm seeing now is Patrick starting to develop those skills that people thought he would never develop in that area, and I think that music has been the stimulus. And it may be through music he's also going to feel more comfortable with people and be able to relate more with people and therefore learn more skills in terms of being with people. Who knows what other sorts of skills he's going to be able to develop? I mean, I would never, ever want to put any limit on how far this child will go.
Obviously, these days there's a whole lot more to Patrick Farley than just an empty shell. There's his ear for Bach, Beethoven and Brahms, dashed off from memory, without music, without training, without even looking. And every day, it seems there's another breakthrough. Today, it's the harpsichord, Patrick's first time at this particular instrument. It's this kind of improvisation that suggests to the Dean of Music at Adelaide University, Brian Chatterton, that Patrick could one day compose his own works.
The fact that he has acquired such a knowledge and understanding of music without any tuition suggests that that will keep going and he will build on that. And if he gets enough command of language, enough communicative skills, and begins to truly structure his understanding of music, then he may be able to go on to something creative in the compositional field.
There's no doubt there's been an amazing transformation. So amazing, in fact, Patrick's considered to be another autistic savant, a very gifted young man.
What is so exciting is that in dealing with this strange and extraordinary ability, the sky's the limit.
A teacher's dedication, a mother's love. Against all the odds, they've brought light to a little boy who fumbled in the dark for so long.
He's the king of primetime soaps. John Forsyth, a Hollywood legend, and the man who took on Joan Collins in Dynasty. But there's much more to Forsyth than meets the eye.
I think when you get that close to a life-threatening situation, that your values change. It would have been nice if I had been able to have done that before the operation. But having the operation, I think, heightened everything.
An untold story. Next week.
An interesting man, John Forsyth. You'll find his story fascinating. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Before we go, I'd like to show you something else from next week. It's about an old guy in a picture he took in the Australian bush many years ago. The photo looks harmless enough until you study it carefully. Good night. See you in the future.
Great, got it. That's fabulous.
When I got the photo developed and printed and looked at it, there's a great big monster-looking thing sitting on a log behind them. I thought, what's this? Couldn't believe it. I thought, this is not human.